And now I'd like to introduce the members of our panel who will be discussing the She Session, a springboard to cultural change. Kathy Minahan is our other distinguished BWWC co-chair. She is a living example of success in the corporate world, having been the first female president and CEO of the Boston Federal Reserve Bank for 14 years. She's a committed advocate for the advancement of women, which is reflected in her current leadership roles on many corporate and nonprofit boards. David Lissy is the current chairman of the board and former executive chairman of Bright Horizons. He brings a global perspective today on what corporations are thinking and doing as it concerns childcare and COVID. Our moderator is my partner at the Mayor's Office, Tanya Del Rio, Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Women's Advancement. MOA has many initiatives underway to support working women during this crisis, including programs like the Child Care Entrepreneur Fund, which empowers family child care educators through cash investment and training in business skills. Take it away, Tanya.
Thank you, Kim. I appreciate your partnership in this work, and it's an honor to be moderating this panel today. So I'll just dive right into it. Dave and Kathy, you know, the word She Session is coming up more and more, and it's one of the more remarkable aspects of the unique period that we're going through in 2020 in the world, and especially in our country. We know schools, childcare providers have been closing, and families are left to juggle a lot of responsibilities. And we want to talk to you about the role that employers can play, because what we've seen is that in September 2020 alone, we had 865,000 women leaving the workforce, which is 4 times the number of men that left the workforce in the same period. And this contrasts with what we've seen in the past. And so I want to start with both of you, because I think David has at Bright Horizons Family Solutions is a large provider of childcare in the US and elsewhere. And Kathy, the BWWC has been providing guidance to employers who are interested in achieving gender equity for a number of years. And so I have a feeling that each of you hold different pieces of the puzzle that we need to address this huge challenge. So I'm going to start with you, David, and ask you, what is your assessment of how employers are dealing with the current situation?
Well, thanks, Tanya. And first, let me say it's a pleasure to be here with you today and with Kathy. And also, I just want to applaud the work that your organizations are doing around this crucial issue. We're pleased to be part of it. Before I go ahead and talk about what COVID has done, I think it's appropriate to say that we have long been dealing with structural challenges that are in the way of making the kind of progress we need to make to support women and working families in the workplace. So even before COVID, with respect to childcare, which is a big issue, we've been dealing with a trilemma for many years. That is access, affordability, and quality. How do we ultimately create a system where working families and women at work can take advantage of it, regardless of issues of affordability, regardless of where they might live or work, and how can everybody get the kind of quality that children deserve? And so that's been going on for many years. And we at Bright Horizons have been trying to play our role in that. We understand that employers are part of the solution, not the entire solution. And as a result, we partner and try to really convince employers that they have a strong stake in this. We've done this for many years and try to advocate to get funding into the system that just doesn't exist without them to help with this trilemma. And we like to think we've been successful, but I'd also say we're still on a journey. And we need the help of government and government supports to augment what employers are doing so that we can create the strength of both together to provide for working families, because employers will never have the ability to make all the investments that are necessary, but I think they can still do a strong part in making that happen. Obviously, COVID, and I'll just quickly stop in a second, COVID has just really sounded the alarm around something that's been going on a long time and really created real acute problems for women and working families. Childcare providers like us were sort of stuck in the mud all of a sudden when COVID hit, forcing us to try to think about how it is we're going to operate in this world. And still that's the case. So the access part of the equation has really diminished, let alone people's ability to afford it or what kind of quality. And that's a real problem. And I'm hopeful that can really be looked at coming out of this. Employers, though, to get the direct heart of your question, employers have stepped up. We have hundreds of employers that we work with that have stepped up with significant investments during this crisis to provide, to make childcare more affordable, mostly on the affordability side. They've also been forced to really lean in on flexibility, which I hope is another area that really shines once this is all over. But we've been fortunate to work with some really progressive employers who have stepped up to support their working women and working families, and we're still eager to make that more widespread.
That's great to know. That's great to know, and it kind of segues into what I want to ask Kathy, because I'm sure some of those really progressive employers should be or are already part of the 100% Talent Compact. And so, Kathy, this year's report that's coming out outlines a lot of interventions that employers could implement to promote gender equity in general, but during COVID, as we just mentioned, it's going to be more necessary. And so they include things like offering on-site and subsidized childcare, paid family leave, sponsorship programs, etc. So I want to know for you, what are the specific recommendations that employers thinking of gender equity should be pulling from this report, and how is the BWWC going to support them in implementing them in the coming year?
Thanks a lot, Tanya, and thank you, David. Before I go into talking about the BWWC and our interventions report, I'd really like, I think David made a very interesting comment on the role of government as well as the role of employers. And I think David and Bright Horizons saw different governments, because they do offer these services internationally in a pretty good volume. I think you've seen different governments handle things differently, David, and I thought you might want to comment a little bit on that.
Well, sure. I think, I've long believed, as I said earlier, that while the employers need to play an important role, government also has its role to play to complete the equation. For example, we do business in the UK and also the Netherlands. And in those two countries, there's pretty progressive government policy that helps to fund quality childcare and make childcare more accessible for more people throughout the country, regardless of where they work. We can work in partnership with that government funding to help the employer to augment that to get the total solution to happen. So when we're working in those countries, the working families that we serve have access to really high quality care, as they do here, but they're paying a fraction of what the total cost would be for the average American. And so we do have micro examples of what I'm talking about in various cities and states throughout the country, but it's not as widespread as it could be in time.
Thanks, David. I knew you had good insights into other government responses, somewhat different from our own. Looking at the Boston Women's Workforce Council, we were brought together in 2013 to end the gender wage gap. But the question is, what is the gender wage gap, and how do you measure it? And what does it imply for the it's hard to even say that word, for what we're going through now in terms of women leaving the workforce. The gender wage gap that we measure when we go out and do reporting every other year looks at the aggregate of male salaries versus the aggregate of female salaries. And that basically says that the raw gender wage gap is about 30 cents on the dollar. And it varies a lot by race, unfortunately. If you look at the Black women versus white men, you get a 49-cent raw gender wage gap. So it's really much larger for women of color than it is for white women. So if that's, and basically what the gender wage gap as we measure it is looking at is not just whether people are being equally paid for equal work. That is after the law. It is part of the law in this country. So it's not equal pay for equal work. It's rather where women are within the organization. Yes, they may be paid equally at the vice president level, but if there are very few of them, the gender wage gap, the raw gender wage gap, is going to look larger because there are more men in higher paid positions than women. Why am I bringing up this little detail of measurement? I'm bringing up this little detail of measurement because if women are already feeling behind the 8 ball at work, that they're not getting ahead to the degree that they expected to get ahead, the kinds of extreme difficulties that COVID has brought about in terms of how to manage households with small children and caregivers and school and working from home and all of that, the ability and the desire to manage all of that difficulty and stay in the workforce has got to be greater and greater. And many women have opted, they've said to themselves, it just isn't worth it. I'm going to drop out of the workforce, come back later if I can, but pay attention to what I need to pay attention to on the home front. And it is women who are more often tasked with keeping the home front running. Now, we've had a decline in labor force participation by men as well, but as Tanya pointed out, nowhere as big as we have for women. Women are the increasingly best educated people in the workforce. They are the people that companies have been recruiting, have been trying to bring into their operations. They've been all sensitive to the idea that diversity produces a better working environment, a more effective and more productive working environment. So it's in employers' advantage to really take note of what they need to do to keep women. And I think David really talked a lot about the childcare solution, which has to be developed from both the private sector, from both the businesses involved, and with, I believe, some government support as well. And let me just talk about one other thing, and that is really understanding where you are. Companies being transparent means that they really ought to look at their raw gender wage gaps and make them known. In the UK, actually, you have to report this. If you're a large company in the UK, you have to report your raw gender wage gaps every year and talk about what you're doing to end them. I'm not saying that we need to go that far, but individual companies need to be very transparent about what they're doing. I could go on. Everybody needs to read our interventions report that we're going to be putting out. You'll all have it in your hands. If not today, then very quickly. And you will see that there are lots of actionable items talked about in the interventions report that will help you make a difference in your own companies and your own workplaces, and maybe you for yourself as a women worker.
David, I also want to talk about Bright Horizons as an employer. I know at the Mayor's Office of Women's Advancement, we support the childcare workforce because it's a workforce that's almost exclusively women, 90% in Boston, and it's majority women of color with a large component of immigrant workers. So for us, it's a priority. And I was wondering, Bright Horizons as an employer, how is it uniquely positioned to be part of the solution for the SHE session during COVID? Bright Horizons normally is employing over 30,000 staff. So I'm wondering what actions have you taken to ease the burden, especially for your women employees?
Well, thanks for that question, Tanya. And let me tell you that, here in Massachusetts, this is our home. So we not only have childcare centers, many of them throughout the state and Commonwealth, but we also have our home office here presently in Watertown, which is home to over 600 workers, many of whom are from Boston. So we have a big workforce in Massachusetts. With respect to women in our workforce, we are a predominantly female workforce at all levels of the company, all the way up to the top of the company. And so we have long had a strong emphasis on being sure we're a great place to work for women, but also at the same time, we're dealing with challenges in an industry that's historically been both hasn't gotten the respect it deserves in society and hasn't been paid accordingly for the work that our teachers do in our centers. And for a lot of years, we've tried to do our best with what limited funding exists in our system to raise the bar for compensation, and then really for benefits. We believe strongly over the years that, you know, I should get the same benefits that a teacher should get. Anybody in Bright Horizons should get the same benefits. So the benefit package that exists for our teachers typically far exceeds what's available in the childcare field, and we've tried to continue to enhance that over time. During COVID, which is the root of your question, our first reaction during COVID, of course, was to try to figure out kind of what does this mean for us, and then our second was, how can we very quickly have childcare for those that need it the most, first responders and healthcare workers throughout the city of Boston. And so we knew that in the early stages of COVID, hospitals were being overwhelmed. And though a lot of female and male workers who worked there had children, they needed to be there and present, and they needed childcare. So we stood up, we were proud that we stood up, you know, a network of childcare centers throughout the city with the cooperation of the folks in the city of Boston and at the state level. And what we did was, you know, our work, people wanted to work. We offered them a premium for working during this time, which we thought was the right thing to do. But really, it's really about the passion that folks in this field have for children and wanting to do the right thing. And they ultimately just wanted to ensure that we were going to be able to create a safe workplace that helped them and took care of them while they were taking care of others. And we developed a number of health protocols and mental health supports and other things that we did to help folks, you know, through this trying time that we're still in and coming out of. But you know, as an employer, we're constantly, you know, trying to do our best. You know, we've been proud of the accolades we've gotten for who we are, but at the same time, we know it's a journey and there's much more to do. And ultimately, we need to do our part in continuing to increase the pay and benefits that are available in this industry, because it's so crucial to the future of our children and families.
Thank you for your thoughts on this. So Kathy and David, now I'm just going to go ahead and ask you to close, to go ahead and predict the future for us here. And I'll start with you, Kathy. So Kathy, the BWWC is the only group that can measure locally at the city level the gender and racial wage gaps. And so I just want to know your prediction for next year. Do you think, because it's a reporting year for the BWWC, do you think we're going to see a widening of the wage gap in Boston next year? Or do you actually think that COVID's going to be that springboard that we were hoping for, right, for cultural change? And that second part of the question, I'd hope you could give us your perspective on too, David.
Sure, thanks, Tanya. You know, when we talk about cultural change, you talk about something that takes a long time. I mean, it's been a really long time that women have been making their way into the workforce and becoming more and more successful, more and more graduates of higher education, even in the mathematical and engineering field. So, you know, women have it's taken a while for women to become the majority of college educated workers and to find their way into the workforce. Now we have this challenge that's exacerbated all the existing challenges of childcare, people involved in elder care, the kinds of things that fall into mostly on women in our culture to deal with. So the work-life balance has gotten really exacerbated with COVID. But companies are seeing that they can't afford to lose the high quality women employees that they've worked so hard to bring into their companies. So I think there's a good place for us right now in terms of movement toward a greater degree of cultural change, movement toward a greater degree of both company and government involvement in such vital things as, you know, paid leave and childcare and the kinds of things, elder care that make it possible for people to both work full time and care for their families at the same time. Now, whether that's going to happen in a measurable way between now and next year, I think is a question that I have an answer to, and I think no way. I think the gap, the gender wage gap that I described before, the raw gender wage gap will get worse potentially before it gets better. But I think we're poised to make a change, and I think many more employers and government see that it's absolutely necessary.
What do you think, David?
Well, thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I guess, look, I would say that I'm optimistic, but I'm also a realist as well. I know, like Kathy mentioned, this is a long journey, but I'm optimistic. The old saying, "Don't let a crisis go to waste," and I don't mean to make light of it because we're in a horrible generational crisis of a lifetime here, but I do believe that there's a light being shined brightly on the importance of some structural supports that I think are really barriers to progress and have been barriers for a long time. Things like flexibility, and I don't just mean flexibility as it relates to being able to work at home, because we all know not every job is suitable to working at home, but flexibility around how employers think about just scheduling work to begin with, and what flexibility exists within that. Those employers that want to engage and have the best talent to deliver on whatever their promise is and whatever their organization does is going to have to think long and hard about what it's going to take to have somebody bring their best self to work. And a lot of that has to do with flexibility and structural supports that make work possible and productive for people. And so, I think when I look at the childcare side of that, I think, I'm really hopeful that more and more employers have stepped up during this crisis and will step up more to support it. And I'm hopeful that, as I talked about before, more governments locally and nationally will take that seriously as well and help to augment, answers. I do think that one area that will need local government attention is access. I think an unfortunate consequence of this crisis has been the inability of many childcare providers to sustain themselves during this crisis. We at Bright Horizons will continue to thrive, I have no doubt, but we're not at this alone. We need many other providers to be part of the solution. And I hope that there are supports given to reattract and embolden providers to be able to deliver again once COVID does lift and once we get to a point where more people can be operational. But I do hope that this is a springboard for the future. I am optimistic, and we'll continue to do our part at Bright Horizons as an employer as well. So it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Absolutely. Thank you, David Lissy, Kathy Minahan, for your insights, for your thoughtful answers. But most of all, really, thank you for the work you've been doing for years on behalf of women, on behalf of gender equity, each of you from your different trench. It's very important, and I'm glad we were able to share it with Compact signers today. And now I'm going to kick it back to Kim Borman.